Hi, everyone. Here we are for our second lecture. I want to remind all of you that you need to write for two of the terms that I'm discussing, and I'll mention each of these terms before the lecture. You have to write for each of these terms a paragraph on the discussion board, as well as a one-paragraph response to one of your classmates' comments. It needs to be in your own words, no Google definitions or anything Google-like definition will be accepted. Okay, what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be the Victorian age and particularly the rise of Charles Darwin. Now, remember we talked before about the idea that France, everything is said to be revolutionary. They're always trying to overthrow the government. They get discontent. They get angry. They take it in a new direction. They get discontent and angry with that and take it in another new direction. Whereas in England, everything's said to be evolutionary. So evolutionary referring to the idea that things slowly but surely evolve and change over time. So they're kind of the polar opposites of Europe. Revolutionary in France, evolutionary in England. And the evolutionary part's referring to Charles Darwin. So we're talking about Darwin in the Victorian world today for our lecture. Okay, let me tell you the terms. Our first term, this would be like the terms I would put on the board. Our first term is Victorian age. Our second term is Charles Darwin. Our third term is T.H. Huxley. Our fourth term is German higher criticism. Our fifth term is social Darwinism. And our sixth term is going to be economic liberalism with a semicolon, social Darwinism with a semicolon, and imperialism. And these three terms together are basically one term. So you're going to want to pick out of these six, two of them to respond to. Write a paragraph and then also the paragraph response to your fellow classmates. Okay, well, the Victorian age is really a fascinating age in English history. It's a very long age. Queen Victoria was a very famous monarch. The period named after her is going to be called the Victorian Age, and it goes from 1837 to 1901. So she was known for being pompous, arrogant, controlling. She also she uses the royal we a lot. So she says, we are not amused, meaning she herself wasn't. All right, now the Victorian age, I'm going to omit a particular affinity for. It's actually my specialty in history. And the Victorian age can be broken up into the early Victorian period. The early Victorian period would basically be 1837 till about 1855. We have the mid-Victorian age, which is going to go from about 1855 to about 1880. And then we have the late Victorian age, which goes from about 1880 to 1901. And Darwin's going to be the person we most associate with the Victorian age other than Queen Victoria herself. Now, people have asked often, who are the three most influential thinkers in the whole 19th century? So think of the whole long 19th century, which is, longer than just the Victorian period, and try to, think who you would think had the most profound impact. Well, usually the three that they come up with who really changed the world around them, and how people understood themselves as well as the world, one is going to be Freud, the other is going to be Marx, and The third is going to be our focus today, Charles Darwin. Okay, and what do we associate Darwin with? We associate him with the theory of evolution. Now notice I say the theory. So it's not the law of evolution. It's not a scientific law, but it's the most widely respected theory about evolution. Now Darwin is not by any means the first person to come up with a theory of evolution. You look back at the height of ancient Athens in the 5th century BC, and there's already a theory, kind of a primitive theory of evolution, trying to explain why is it that animals with a heavy coat live in cold climates, whereas those with a thin coat live in warmer climates. Well, Darwin's theory is going to be a whole lot more detailed than that. And sometimes people like to see him as a person that hated the church and was all about trying to destroy conventional religion. Well, it actually couldn't be further from the truth. Darwin himself was a very religious man. He grew up in a very religious family. And like all of us, Darwin was very much a product of his time. Okay, so Darwin grew up during the Victorian age. Now let's try to think of some things we think of with the Victorian age. You know, if we use the word Victorian as an adjective, what comes to mind? You know, try to think of what are some things that we think of as Victorian. Victorian clothes, of course. That's going to be one thing. Victorian clothes are frilly, they're very detail-oriented, they're long, they're grand. Now what about Victorian literature? You know, Victorian literature is itself a very broad topic. I believe we have here at Del Val every now and then they have a course from the English department on Victorian literature. So Victorian literature is itself pretty broad, but what are some aspects that really come across as standing out about the literature of the Victorians, or as some of the people in the English department like to say, the literature of the Victorians? Well, one thing is it's very long-winded. Now, my specialty is, as I said, Victorian studies, which is, you know, part of the reason why I include a lot more about the art and the music and the general culture rather than just the politics and economic trends. So I'm looking at it from the point of view of music, of art, of literature, of philosophy, things we think of as, you know, part of the general humanities. Well, Victorian literature, the thing that probably most stands out about it is how long-winded it is. It goes on and on and on forever. It can go on a whole page. You could have like one idea as one long sentence joined with a lot of semicolons. Now, you know, when I was studying Victorian literature, I was thinking about it a lot. I remember I once even had a dream that I was, you know, in the Victorian age, and it started in the dream talking like that. Well, I began writing that way as well. Well, one of my professors quickly knocked the style out of me. He kept putting the term WW, wasted words, on everything. So there's no reason to put this. There's no reason to put quite. Does quite do anything to the sentence? Really doesn't. We're saying the same thing without 4 or 5 quites, or indeed 1. Okay, so the Victorian's very long-winded, which is kind of the opposite stylistically of the way we communicate today. You know, think of how you communicate usually with your friends or online, and you're mostly using a lot of acronyms. Okay, so we're trying to make things as short as possible, saying TTYL, talk to you later. The Victorians are very about the beauty of language, and it's very decorative. Now, almost all aspects of their lives were very decorative. Think of a Victorian home. Well, a Victorian home, one good example is that place across from the Starbucks in downtown Doylestown, the hotel that has that place with the great pretzels. Well, we look at the building itself of that hotel. It has the turrets. It looks from a different period. So Victorian architecture is in itself very eclectic. Many different styles juxtaposed. You could have a Queen Anne style. You could have a Tudor style. A whole lot of different styles all together. You could have even something that looks like a medieval castle. That would be still part of the Victorian style. So it's very eclectic. Now, same thing, look at the way they write things. You look at their script, very detailed. It looks like calligraphy, just everyday script. It looks like it'd be for a formal wedding invitation. And it could just be a simple note. All right, so the Victorians, very decorative. The clothes are decorative. Their homes are decorative. Look at the interiors of the Victorian homes. The interiors of the Victorian homes are going to be, once again, very eclectic. They're going to have lots of different styles juxtaposed, and they don't believe at all in minimalism in any form. Put as many things as you can out, even if the styles, to us, don't seem to go together. So you could have a bright plaid and next to wide stripes, next to a floral chintz pattern, and cushions in really bright colors. So lots of different styles all together. Just part of that age. Now, another thing about the Victorian age is it's also very religiously based. Now, religion was a really big part of almost everybody's everyday life. It was talked about, it was thought about. People on average in the Victorian age, particularly the early to mid-Victorian age, they usually went to church about 3 times a week. Once a week, the longest service would be on Sunday. So you would go to maybe a 2.5-hour service. Then you would spend the rest of the day in quiet pursuits, contemplating the message that you learned there in church. Another day would be for Bible study. You would kind of be looking at the Bible, reading the Bible, and looking for biblical examples to explain everything to their contemporary society. There might be a third day for evangelical activities when you're passing out religious tracts, telling people, have you heard the good news? So religion is just a big part of their identity. One of the first things you would ask somebody is, what's your faith? It would almost be like, you go to a college party, what would be one of the first things you would ask? You would ask, what's your major? Now, why would you ask that? You would ask that because it would tell you a lot about them. What are they interested in? How long are they going to be in school? What are they good at? Do you have certain things in common? So it would be an important part of people's everyday identity. So for the Victorians, it's going to be, what's your faith? So Darwin himself grew up in a wealthy family and from a family with a religious background. Now, he's going to make certain discoveries that contradict almost everything that he had been taught to believe in. And let's think for a minute how upsetting that might be. Let's say, you go to Catholic school, your parents sacrificed a lot to send you there, and you get an education, a very good education often, but from a particular perspective. Then suddenly you're out of Catholic school, you go to a secular college, and then you suddenly hear people, some are Wiccan, some are atheists, some are agnostic, some are Muslim, some are Buddhist, some are Jews, some are evangelical Christians, some are just mainstream Protestants. So there's all these different people with different religious beliefs. So suddenly your ideas start being questioned. And then suddenly you find it disturbing because you were taught to believe a certain way and you're hearing things from a different perspective. And that's sort of what happened to Darwin. Okay, the fact that Darwin was from a wealthy background was important because basically coming from a wealthy background meant he had an inherited income, so he didn't have to worry like most of us in earning a weekly or monthly salary. So he could live off of the checks that he received. and basically spend his time pursuing what he was interested in, not necessarily what he could earn a living from. Okay, well, he was interested in science. Well, science for the Victorians was seen as frivolous, kind of a hobby. It was seen as a rich hobby that gentlemen would do for fun. So kind of like bird watching or stamp collecting. It would be like today trying to say, I want to be a professional golfer. Now, there are very few people that can earn a very good living as a professional golfer. Think of Tiger Woods. But for most people, you're spending money playing golf. It's seen as an expensive hobby, not a way to make money. Well, that's the way science was seen. So it's a gentleman's hobby, just something you dabble in the sciences, something you do for fun to entertain yourself with. Okay, now Darwin goes on the ship, the HMS Beagle, in the late 1830s, and he goes on this sailing ship as a naturalist. Okay, a naturalist would be someone interested in the natural world. We could see a naturalist as a general scientist. Now, would anyone today classify themselves as a general scientist? No. It's too broad. It wouldn't mean anything. Like, you just say, I'm a scientist. Well, what does that really tell you? It would be like putting on your Facebook page, I'm a person. Well, nobody's going to disagree with that, but it's not very interesting. It doesn't say anything about you. So saying you're a scientist wouldn't say very much about you either today. Because, what would be the question you would ask after that? The natural thing to ask would be, what kind of scientist? Are you a crop scientist? Are you a biologist? Are you an astrophysicist? Are you an organic chemist? A zoologist? They're all vastly different. So just saying a scientist wouldn't be broad enough or wouldn't be specific enough to mean anything. But the fact that he was able to class himself as a naturalist shows us that it was just someone interested in science in general. Now, when we think about science, and I know science is something many of you are interested in here at the college, try to think, what is it you find so interesting about science? Well, one of the things interesting about science is the fact that you're making new discoveries, that the answers aren't already set. So you could make a discovery, but once you make that discovery, you have no idea in what direction that discovery is going to go. It would be, later on, when you eventually take the U.S. history course, you're going to be talking about, atomic bombs. And, when people came up with the atomic bomb, people were divided. Was this a good invention or a bad invention? They're going to say it's the way to end the war. But once that information's out there, is there any way to bring it in? The Soviet Union got atomic weapons in 1949, 4 years after the end of the war. And today, what are we worried about? That some rogue regime is going to get atomic weapons. Okay, so the idea of atomic weapons or, science, but is the fact of making a new discovery. All right, so he made a new discovery. He made discovery about these little birds, finches, and about the specifics about their beaks. So he took copious notes while he was there in the Galapagos Islands, Galapagos, Galapagos Islands in Ecuador, South America, which is, by the way, supposed to be a very beautiful place. My cousin was there a couple years ago and said it was gorgeous. All right, so he goes there, he takes the voyage, he takes the notes, and he basically develops his theory about evolution. This theory is eventually going to be published in Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species. Now, On the Origin of Species is his magnus opus. He publishes that in the year 1859. He then publishes another very important work in the year 1877. These works are transformative works. They're going to completely change how people understand themselves and understand the world. But here's the thing. They're based on information that he gathered in the late 1830s, but he doesn't publish it till 20 years later, till 1859. Okay, now, as we talked about, many of you are in science. Would would you say that's common in science, to make it a discovery he believes important and just kind of table it for 20 years? No, you would never do that. Now, why? You probably wouldn't do that because what would be your fear? Your fear would be somebody else would get the information, get the copyright on it, and get all the credit, and then you'd be nothing but an imitator or a poser. So the fact that Darwin has this theory that he knows is very important, and basically decided not to publish it for 20 years, says there's something about it that he finds disturbing. And he did, because it contradicted everything that he ever believed in, every belief that he ever had. So he grew up in a religious family, and he also married and loved a very religious woman. So Darwin was himself kind of a quiet, introspective type who did not want to get in fights with most people in society. So he knew the religious establishment would be horrified by some of the discoveries that Darwin made, so he doesn't know what to do with it. He has a big dilemma. Should he publish his findings, or should he keep it to himself? Now, he is going to face pressure. Okay, who's he going to face pressure from? He faces pressure from his closest friend, our next term number 2, I'm sorry, actually our next term number 3, Thomas Henry Huxley. Okay, Thomas Henry Huxley is Darwin's best friend. He gets the nickname of Darwin's Bulldog. Now, you always have to look, why is someone called a certain thing? They get a nickname for a certain purpose. So what are some of the qualities that we think of with a bulldog? A bulldog is protective. It's a strong, stubborn, powerful dog, but a loyal dog. Okay. Now, Huxley is coming from a different background, different socio-economic background than Darwin. Huxley is coming from a middle-class background. And Huxley is basically trying to earn a living as a scientist at a time when science was seen as a hobby, not as a way to earn a living. So an avocation rather than a vocation. He is a comparative anatomist. He's trained as a comparative anatomist, which is a form of biology. So he's basically a biologist. Now, he tries to earn a living as a biologist and finds it very, very difficult. It would be like trying to, earn a living as a classics professor today. One time in the Victorian age, the most popular major was classics. Today, it's a very unpopular major and a difficult thing to try to earn a living as a classics professor. All right, so he's trying to earn a living as a scientist, as a biologist, Huxley, at a time when science was seen as a hobby. Now, Huxley is a different kind of personality than Darwin. Huxley is temperamental, fiery, angry, and he wants to get in a large, brassy, loud debate with the religious establishment. So Darwin wants to hide and just kind of talk about science with like-minded friends. Huxley doesn't. He wants a world-class, big, brassy confrontation with the religious establishment because he's angry. Huxley feels science has practical applications. Science can make people's lives better. Science is empirical. Science follows the scientific method where the information's out there for anyone to test and take in new directions. Science, can make people's lives better. Religion, Huxley believes, really doesn't do anything. It basically just comes up with what it says is the truth and then says, accept it on faith if there's no actual truth proving it. So he says that's ridiculous. Why should religion, which is based on faith, get all the acclaim, whereas science gets all the money? Why does religion, which is based on faith, get all the money, whereas science, which has practical applications, is seen as just a unimportant hobby? Okay, so Darwin is constantly being pushed by Huxley to publish his findings. Now, what finally pushes him over the edge and gets him to publish his findings is another evolutionist by the name of Wallace comes up with a theory which is very similar to Darwin. So Darwin hears about it and basically has to make the decision, either publish his findings before Wallace does or forever remain mute about it. Well, Darwin finally gets up the courage and publishes his findings, and as everyone expected, suddenly the religious establishment gets extremely angry, and there's a lot of debates and a lot of people hearing about these new ideas of evolutionary theory to kind of go against the ideas of creationist views. Now, the idea is that the Bible is the literal word of God, and God is the creator of everything, is called creationism. Another word for creationism is fundamentalism. So basically saying the fundamentals of life come from God, and God is the creator. So a lot of conflict between the ideas of the creationists versus the ideas of the new evolutionists. Now, I don't want to give the impression that suddenly everyone turned away from God and became an atheist or an agnostic. Now, let's look at that term agnostic for a minute. Huxley is going to be the first one to use that term agnostic. Agnostic is spelled Agnostic. Agnostic, he's going to be the first one to use this Greek term agnostic and put it into English. Now, an agnostic is not an atheist. An atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says there may be or there may not be a God. We just don't know. But we can't just automatically accept there's a God because it makes us more comfortable or more happy. So we just have to accept that we, at this point, don't know. Okay, so Huxley is himself an agnostic and brings that term into popular discourse in England. Now, after Darwin's theory comes out, people are still going to church, but they're having some religious skepticism and some religious doubts in ways that they never did before. Prior to that point, they just had blind obedience to the Bible. If it's, most people, if it said it in the Bible, it's the truth, and didn't think twice about it. Suddenly, they begin having questions about certain events in the Bible. Now, there's going to be a philosophical movement coming out of Germany, starting about the late 1860s. This movement is going to be called, our next term, German Higher Criticism. Now, German Higher Criticism is a movement where some German philosophers basically say that the only way to keep the Bible alive and well and meaningful is to basically purge, get rid of the supernatural elements of the Bible. But they say don't throw out the whole Bible because parts of it are based on myth. So they say we have to purge the supernatural things, the things that can't be proven. Things like the Holy Trinity, the virgin birth, the parting of the Red Sea. Because when you think about it, what's the main way most people could really accept these things? Based on faith, not on scientific evidence. So they say the German higher critics say don't get rid of the whole Bible because parts of it are fantastic or fantastical, but rather keep the other parts alive. Like think of the importance of the Ten Commandments. They're used as a code of justice, a way for people to get along in society, and they make a lot of sense when you think about them. Honor thy mother and thy father, don't covet thy neighbor's wife. These are things that are going to basically make it possible to live in a harmonious society. So as a way of keeping the Bible alive, the German higher critics say get rid of the supernatural elements, but don't get rid of the Bible itself. Okay, our last term for this lecture is is kind of a triple term: economic liberalism, semicolon, social Darwinism, semicolon, and imperialism. Now, why are these three ideas, am I putting them together as one term? Because basically we can put these three ideas together as the way that the Victorian people thought. They were based on similar kinds of thinking. Let's see how. Okay, economic liberalism we talked about before, in our face-to-face classes. Economic liberalism, or laissez-faire, is the idea of a hands-off approach to the economy, and comes right out of Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. The idea that the government should have a hands-off approach to the economy, not get involved in economic relations. Okay, the second element is social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is the idea of the application of Darwin's ideas to society. So social Darwinism is sometimes called the survival of the fittest. So the idea that basically there's competition in society, some make it, some don't. Just like some businesses. Some businesses are going to survive this horrible, events we're having now and become stronger and prosper. Others are not going to make it and are going to be, unfortunately, become extinct. Okay, but then we have so social Darwinism means the application of Darwin's ideas of competition between species applied to society. So the survival of the fittest. And then the third element would be imperialism. Okay, we sometimes think of imperialism as the same as colonialism. So that's based on the idea of the stronger nations taking over the weaker nations. Now, just like the stronger animals are going to eat the weaker animals, or the bigger businesses are going to kill off the smaller businesses, that's always been part of civilization, competition. So all three of these ideas, economic liberalism, social Darwinism, and imperialism, all three ideas are based on competition. With economic liberalism, there's competition between businesses. Some make it, some don't. Social Darwinism, this idea of survival of the fittest, some animals make it, others die out, the ones who can't adapt and change. What happens, unfortunately, to the runt of a litter of kittens or puppies, they often are competing with the other animals for nourishment from their mother, and they're kicked away and they die off. Just a sad part of nature, but always been the case in nature. And then we have imperialism, the idea of the strong countries competing with the weak ones and taking over the weak ones as a natural part of life.